seems to me that issues, well, I'm reminded of, you're so even-handed. We get the positives and the negatives. I was thinking of Truman's one-handed economics. And so I think we should open it right up to discussion, rather than mine. Go ahead. Question.
What seems to be most important was political economy. What will they do in light of the financial issues that are grave at this time with no end in sight, even if there are little glimmers of hope here and there? There's a difference between what happens on Wall Street and what happens for the people. That's A. And B, the problem that they have in the United States with the high unemployment, and which certain places in the United States begin to look like a third world situation with exports from these major countries. How do you see that playing? Because, you know, the people may not be so comfortable with that in the long run, where they are poor, even if they're in an industrialized country, with no access to monies, even if the banks are making a tremendous amount of money at this particular time, and other factors of training, and you also have skilled people without work in the United States. So there's a lot of factors here that will create issues in the future. And how do you see that going?
You want to respond? You want to let a few? Why don't we have a few comments?
Questions?
Let's take
okay.
a few comments
yeah.
so we get some voices from the floor. Yes, right here.
Yes, I have.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I have a question about China's positive impact on the developing world. Now, you mentioned that in the aggregate, you know, investment and aid is still insignificant. But what I want to say is China seems to be targeting certain countries, you know. Like you also said that this happens with the socialist world. You know, Russia used to be was the only country that gave aid to Cambodia, where I was stationed. Now it is China who is the main investor in Cambodia, as well as provider of foreign aid. So what I want to say, it seems like China is targeting not just for economic, but for some kind of political reason, certain countries, maybe African countries. Myanmar, of course, but Myanmar is different than Cambodia. Cambodia today is open to the world, but China is number one there, both in investment and in foreign aid.
Thank you. Did you have your hand up? Yes, please.
Dr. Nayyar, it was great hearing you after a long time. My question to you is that, you know, how do you see bilateral relationship between China and India, which will impact their own economic development as well as influence on developing countries as well as with the US? Another question is that you said that lack of coordination at present between China, India, Brazil, and these CIS, the countries. Now, do you think in any way the cultural, the geographical differences are the reasons, more overpowering reasons than the economic development within their own countries, and they can't see that much influence, and they cannot overcome their cultural barriers of communication with each other, so they cannot coordinate. Do you think that economic is the one which is overshadowing, or is really the culture is which is overshadowing?
Go ahead, and then we'll come to Deepak.
And I happened to borrow, which I'll return to the outside news. Outside, you had the newspapers out. But while I was waiting outside, I just happened to read this, and I'm wondering how it's going to affect the world. It says, cuts to food aid put millions at the risk of starvation. Loss of a generation of children is possible, warns the head of the UN program. Tens of millions of world poor will have their food cut, and it'll be a lost generation of children to malnutrition, food riots, and political destabilization. And how does that fit in with the, humanitarian, but also more humanitarian, but also the economic mess of the world for future generations, which doesn't seem to be a main issue about how many children will die and how many, both in terms of the sadness of life and also, where are economics going if we can save a generation of children?
Well,
go ahead.
There are dangers in attempting to paint a picture with broad strokes on a wide canvas. But fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I think we often lose sight of the big picture, and that, in a sense, was the object of my lecture. But each of the questions raised are important questions, and some were addressed in the lecture, others were not. But let me address the questions briefly in the order that they were posed. In response to you, may I say at the outset, in my judgment, we need to recognize the basic fact of life, even in the early 21st century. In spite of the financial crisis in the United States and the deepest crisis in Western capitalism since the Great Depression, recovery depends in large part on what happens in the United States. And China and India may be minor participants in the process, but they are not players. And in almost every sense of the word, they are much more in a reactive mode than a proactive mode. And I think their capacity to address the crisis depends essentially on two things: what they do within their countries, and the Chinese have exhibited more determination in terms of a very large fiscal stimulus to attempt to combat unemployment and the contraction in exports than the Indians have, who have been stuck in the mode of conservative macroeconomic policies. But it depends in part on what they do within. If they can sustain their growth even as the rest of the world slows down, and this continues for 3 years or longer, they are going to be able to exercise more influence. And the second thing it depends on is whether they see, and that relates to the other questions that have been posed, whether they relate to each other and exercise the logic of international collective action, see the possibilities of solidarity among developing countries, and see themselves as a counterpoint together to the United States, rather than each one weighing the United States to counteract the other. Now, your question is interesting, but I will give it a somewhat different twist. I agree that, in large part, what we see as the economic engagement of China in particular, but also India and Brazil with the rest of the world, there may be more to it than meets the eye. And it's not just the pursuit of profit or national economic interests, it's also a strategic geopolitics. And there is no question that the Chinese engagement with Africa, whether it is repressive regimes, whether it is ethnic strife, whether it is movements of large numbers of Chinese citizens into African countries, Lesotho, for example, where they've taken over the entire retail trade, there's a lot of resentment in the local community, is driven essentially by a geopolitical interest that has to do with two motives. The first is to source for raw materials. You know, the story on the Congo, many people know about it, but it's been driven largely by Chinese strategic interests. And it is selective. So it's Myanmar, it's Congo, it's Ethiopia, it's countries that the Chinese set out to choose, and there are 5 or 6 in Africa. It is being done for that purpose. But there is a major difference between China on the one hand and India and Brazil or even South Africa on the other. In China, engagement in the world is driven largely by the state. So whether the Chinese petroleum company or sourcing for energy or sourcing for metals, there's a close connect between what the corporates do and what the Foreign Office wants. On the other hand, if you look at India, Brazil, there is almost no coordination on the part of the state. You know, India's presence in Africa is driven largely by the private sector, as is Brazilian presence elsewhere, with not an active role on the part of governments in engaging with developing countries. Now, in some ways, that may be better for developing countries in terms of bargaining positions, because they're dealing with corporates, they're dealing with uncoordinated engagement rather than strategic coordinated arrangement. And I think in many ways, the presence of India and South Africa in Africa will make almost as much of a difference if it grows as China's arrival did vis-a-vis Western powers. So in a sense, they will introduce checks and balances between themselves. Okay. Your question, I think it is a fundamental question, and I think that it is something I did not address in my lecture. In many ways, you know, what China, India, Brazil, and South Africa can do over the next 50 years to transform the world will depend in large part on what they can do to transform themselves. Now, China has seen the most rapid growth in human history. We know from both theory and experience that income distributions change very slowly over time. But China has also witnessed the most rapid increase in inequalities in human history, with a Gini coefficient that's gone from, 0.28 to 0.48 in the space of 2 decades. India excludes a large part of its population from this process of development or prosperity. So, there is an India that's global, and there is a Bharat that's local, and there's no connect between the two. If you take, many people debate poverty numbers. And, whether the proportion living below the poverty line in India is 20%, as the government claims, or 30%, as some critics claim, is really a matter of quibble, because these are people who are below the poverty line defined in terms of critical minimum nutrition intake, with no allowance for clothing, shelter, let alone education and healthcare. Now, that's at the, it's not the same story, but if you take $1 PPP per day, that's India's poverty line. But if you raise that poverty line to $2 PPP per day, then the proportion of Indians who live below that somewhat higher line is 77%. Okay? So the group that's vulnerable is a very large part of the population. Okay? Brazil, I think, Lula deserves much credit in a second innings when he failed completely in the first at attempting to create, whether it is a reduction in the Gini coefficient, and that's discernible in Brazil, whether it's the redistribution of land to the landless and having appropriated it from large landowners, there is some evidence of Brazil becoming less unequal than it was. South Africa, how many years after apartheid, it is appalling, the exclusion of people, what you see. So in many ways, while I painted the macro picture, it's not that I intended to forget the story you want to focus on. I actually am convinced that the capacity of these countries to change themselves, to change the world and to change themselves, depends on what they do to include their own people. And many people here would be familiar with the work of Karl Polanyi. In many ways, I think these countries need a great transformation as well. So that, if the balance shifted to, what he called the double swing, away from the state to the market completely. But I think the crisis represents an opportunity for these countries if they are able to find a more creative interaction between the state and the market that includes these children, these people who are excluded. And I think that all the kind of arithmetic of compound growth rates could become a reality if there is inclusion in the process of development, and these countries begin to use their most abundant resource, people, for the purpose of development. So that is an important question. I don't know whether I have provided you with an answer.
Laura, Ed, take
Thank
another
you.
round. And then we'll
I
get
have
final
three very
responses.
brief questions. The first one is, why did you choose the categories of China, Brazil, South Africa, and India? I was excited about that because I teach economic development, and they fit in each of the World Bank categories, and that's cool. But they might be drivers in their regions, but that doesn't mean that they're drivers in the world economy. Secondly, there's different types of drivers. I mean, you mentioned yourself, China is a colonizer. China drives the international economy by colonizing, unlike South Africa, India, and Brazil, possibly, I think, to a much larger extent. So that's something also to think about. So I'm just wondering why you chose these four countries. The second question I have is, isn't it more meaningful, I don't know, to use per capita growth in GDP as opposed to just growth in GDP, for instance, as a comparison? And the third question that I have is, what do you want? I mean, what are you looking for these countries? Do you want these countries to make our lives better in advanced capitalist countries? Do you want these countries to make the lives better for the citizens within their countries? I mean, I applaud you that, this is a huge, you really deal with the whole international arena, but, in terms of a sort of a moral question in terms of what you want, I mean, are we just sort of focused on making our lives better, or making the lives better of people that live in these countries?
Sorry, and your second question, remind me, was?
My second question was whether you should use per capita growth in GDP.
All right. Okay.
Ed.
Ed.
The four countries are projected ahead to grow, but in each case, it seems that there is ahead a problem that could completely derail the process of growth. And if one looks back, each of the countries in the past has had very serious problems, which they have overcome, yes, but maybe not completely. In the case of China, broadly speaking, politics and the position of the party is a potential, in a sense, deal breaker. In the case of India, there is the gap between the modern part of India and rural India, and yet it seems that the process of development is going to impact on rural India and may lead to a very large shift of population to already unmanageable cities. In the case of Brazil, there have been political splits within Brazil, and the question is whether they could come up again, and South Africa has not actually managed to significantly start a process of development in spite of quite a few years since apartheid. I just wonder if you could comment on the prospects of these countries continuing to grow.
Okay, important questions, difficult questions. First, why did I choose these four countries and not some others? I think the choice of China and India is almost obvious. Given the size of their populations, given the size of their geographical space, given even their share in world income. I think the choice of Brazil is also plausible, because if we are to look at the one country in Spanish America, which is Portuguese speaking, it is a large country. It has technological capabilities. It has a whole range of attributes which make it a potential lead economy, not just in the region, but in the world. The choice of South Africa, I must say, is much more difficult to find a robust reason for, other than my intuition. You know, in a sense, if you think of a country in Africa, for all its flaws and warts, and I agree with that, you know, South Africa in many ways is a complete failure post-apartheid. If you look at the process in economy and society, the political process is something else in terms of political rights for people. The choice of South Africa is less than obvious, but if we were thinking of a country from Africa, it seemed to me the most plausible candidate, right? It's not the same as the other three. Brazil, I'm willing to venture, is probably as significant in a qualitative sense, if not in a quantitative sense, as China and India. Second, by the way, in all my numbers, I may have rushed through them. I'd be happy to give you a copy of the paper. The analysis also is in terms of GDP per capita. And in many ways, China and India's performance in terms of GDP per capita growth is striking, particularly in the past 25 years. It's attributable in part to the higher GDP growth rates, but in larger part to the lower population growth rates. And that the arrival of the demographic transition is beginning to make a difference. But I agree, it would have to be GDP per capita. It makes more sense. And in another paper I've done, I've said that we are, you know, the early 21st century represents the end of divergence in incomes between rich countries and poor countries, but there is no evidence yet of a beginning of convergence. So GDP per capita matters. Yeah. What is my motive? I wish I knew. I'm the analyst and I'm the scholar. But let me tell you, in a sense, I'm trying to understand a conjuncture in history where things are beginning to change. But perhaps it's too early in some ways. But if you were to ask for my motive, why am I studying these countries? I would say that the most important motive is what these countries can do for their own peoples. If they can include them in the process of development, if they can eradicate poverty and not let inequality grow by leaps and bounds, that is an important development objective. And in so doing, I think they may be able to do something for excluded peoples in other parts of the developing world, and indeed for excluded people in industrial societies. But my primary concern is what these countries do within their borders for their own people. For what they can do for people deprived or excluded elsewhere depends almost entirely on that. So I do not know whether that answers your question. Ed, you're absolutely right. I mean, I agree with you that each of these countries confronts enormous difficulties. And, you know, if you were to read the pink pages of our newspapers, you would think that China and India have already transformed the world. It's nowhere near that. I think they face very serious economic and political problems. China, I think, there is, in the polity, there's a real problem with sustainability. How long can the Chinese Communist Party sustain this political system? Just as there is a problem with the declining productivity of investment in China, in the economy. In India, you know, this crisis in agriculture, the collapsing infrastructure, what people see as our greatest strength, I think, is our greatest weakness. You know, the spread of education in society is just abysmal. In Brazil, Similarly, if you look at the exclusion of people, of regions, the northeast of Brazil is frightening. Inequalities between Sao Paulo and the rest of Brazil, and South Africa. I mean, you know, you can describe it in graphic terms. Yet, I think, I think a better world is possible. I see more reason for hope than for despair in each of these countries. Because I think that, just as the spread of markets has produced kind of ideologies and outcomes that are unacceptable to many of us, the spread of democracy is doing something else. The people who are excluded by the economics of markets are included by the politics of democracy. And my sense is that, India may be a democratic regime, China may be an authoritarian regime, but in the ultimate analysis, all regimes, however authoritarian or however democratic, are accountable to their people. And if you really were to ask me, what is the reason I see that things might get better rather than worse, and they could get worse, is that, there is, with the spread of democracy, in each of these societies, Brazil is changing, South Africa is changing. I think that accountability of governments to people could make a difference. That is really the reason why I think a better world is possible. It may not come to pass. I do not know. But we have seen evidence. After all, if you read, you look at the story of China and India. In the early 50s, China and India were role models to everyone in the post-colonial world. Socialism in the second country or non-capitalist development, state capitalism. By the mid-70s, 25 years later, both China and India were seen as disaster stories, that nothing worse was possible. And another 25 years later, both of them are role models or poster children on the virtues of markets and openness. The countries haven't changed as much as perceptions have changed. In a sense, I think there is more continuity than change. But I think both China and India have addressed their economic problems, and if you compare it with the preceding 100 years, in a way that is quite amazing. If you look at it in a span of history, 50 years, we have miles to go, but much has also happened. So on the whole, I see reason for hope rather than for despair. And really this hope comes to me from the politics of democracy. I'm sorry, I did not answer your question. Forgive me. You had asked me, if you remind me, I'll take 2 minutes. I did remember till...
Yeah, I was asking this bilateral relationship
Oh, yes.
between China and India.
I think that's an important question. I do not know the answer to the question. At this moment, both China and India are engaged at the level of the state, not at the level of the people, with the pursuit of their so-called national interests in the international community. And it's mostly a quest for power. They both want to be superpowers in politics, powerhouses in economics, and that's what is driving them. Now, in a sense, the relationship between them and the United States is the heart of the matter. And whether it is India's strategic engagement with the U.S. or China's emerging competition with the U.S., they are driven largely by that national interest. And at this moment, I think the politics at the level of governments and at the level of states in China and India is characterized much more by rivalry than by unity. But my sense is that in all these situations, flag often follows trade. So that if the economic relationship between China and India gets more intertwined, and by the way, it's growing at a rapid pace in spite of what both governments are doing in terms of trade, in terms of movement of people, that could make a difference. But they have to begin to see the logic of international collective action in terms of what the two of them can do together, rather than what one can do to the other in partnership with the United States. I think that's the mindset which needs to change in China and India. And at the moment, the United States remains the political pole.
Let's give a big thank you to Deepak. I just wanted to say another indicator you didn't give of the stasis in the balance of power is that the Yankees, of course, are beating up on the Angels once again. Let's give a big thank you to Deepak.